an original.
From Story Studio Network.
The 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. What would it take to eliminate poverty in Canada by the year 2030? This is the 2030 Project. It's a podcast that explores why poverty persists and what we can do about it in this country. We endeavor to uncover what's been successful with Canada's poverty reduction strategy, but then what needs to come next? The 2030 Project tackles some of the biggest and the most pressing social issues facing this country today. I'm Dave Trafford, and thanks for joining us. In this episode of the 2030 Project, we start with the basics. What is the meaning of poverty? How do you and I interpret poverty? In the last episode, Diane Dyson, VP of Advocacy and Research at Daily Bread Food Bank, suggested we have developed a new or a heightened understanding of poverty during the course of our collective experiences during COVID-19. She may be onto something. So we invited Ujwal Arkalgud. He's the Executive Vice President at Lux Research to join this conversation. Ujwal is a cultural anthropologist who uses technology to study the implicit meanings behind concepts, ideas, trends, issues in culture. Ujwal, it's good of you to be here. All right, so I want to pick your brain, Ujwal, on what I am noticing, and clearly I do not have the lens that you bring to this as a cultural anthropologist. But as we are recording this season of the 2030 Project, we are in the midst of an election campaign in Ontario. And one of the things that I've noted in other episodes, one of the things that has struck me is that poverty has become a policy discussion, a point of policy discussion, and a priority for all four of the major parties. So we've got the Conservatives, the NDP, the Liberal, and Green. They're not all quite on the same page, but they're reading from the same chapter almost now, because they have all said we need to increase the Ontario Disability Support Program. In some cases, we need to double it just to make it work. We need to increase Ontario Works, the welfare program, because there's an implicit recognition that we cannot afford poverty. To me, that's kind of an important development. And I wonder how that might be related to a general or maybe a down in the weeds, closer to the ground understanding of what poverty is. And if in fact COVID didn't refocus that or inform that for us.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the election, Dave, the one thought that I keep having is I still don't see people using the P word, the privilege word, enough in discourse and conversation. The reason I bring that up is, that's a word that, through the anthropological lens, that's a word that has really blown up. If you want to talk about trends, it's a word that's really blown up in the last couple of years in particular.
As a pejorative?
No, as a positive, as this idea that I need to examine what privileges I have as a human being.
So it's exercise in self-awareness more than anything.
It's an exercise in self-awareness, and it's an exercise that helps us determine what are some of the things that we should be a lot more thoughtful around. Not just in how we speak to one another, let's say in a work environment, in a social circle, but also in terms of how we think about who we vote for, the questions we ask, the expectations we have from the different parties that are seeking our vote and so on. And the reason I bring up the privilege topic is because it very much connects to the other P word, which is poverty. Because in essence, what's happening is we're in an environment. I think just the other day I saw that savings, the average Canadian is saving, again, more than they have ever, I think, in more than 50 or 60 years. The same is happening in the United States. So savings are going up. So in many ways, the divide between the haves and the have-nots is widening from a socioeconomic perspective. But the other interesting aspect is it is also widening from a cultural perspective, because we are seeing through the Great Resignation that those with privilege have the ability to resign and find other meaningful work and ask the questions of, is this work meaningful, purposeful? Am I doing what I need to do? Those without privilege, those who are straddling the poverty line, those who know that if they lose a particular shift or lose a job, that they will fall into poverty. They don't have that luxury in their lives. So I think first and foremost, I'm surprised that we aren't talking about that more. I think the conversation about poverty is happening, but the problem, this is just what we see when we study culture. The problem with talking about it purely through the lens of poverty is it others a group. And when you other a group, it makes those who are not part of that group think, I'll care about it on the surface, but, does it really affect me? And I think that's the gap that I would love to see resolved.
So given that, I mean, to your point first about privilege, if we are more aware, self-aware, we're using that awareness more in our approach to whether it's things we buy in the store or whom we vote for, and we have a heightened discussion around poverty, do you get a sense that those two things are getting closer together, or are we just sort of still standing on the edge of the chasm and we're not making any headway?
No, we are making a lot of headway. We're just, still a good few years away from true mainstream acceptance and understanding of what these issues are and how they impact me as an individual, even if I'm not somebody who falls on sort of the poverty spectrum, right? And I think that's the positive side of the equation, but that's just the natural headwind, if you will. Mm-hmm. The question I think we all need to ask is, in whatever work we do, whether it's as politicians, as citizens in the jobs we hold, nonprofits, what can we do to speed up that process? Because I think until we speed up that process, until that Venn diagram actually turns into a Venn diagram, right now it's two circles, they're inching towards each other, but until we start to see a massive overlap there, people are not going to realize that this affects me. And I think this is the fundamental reality of human beings. As anthropologists, sometimes we have to remind everybody that as human beings, we are built to tell the world, look at me, I'm not selfish. Look at me. I'm not that person. But we are innately, we're just built like that.
Look at me, I'm not selfish. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. But we're innately built like that. And I think until we get to how does this impact me, that opportunity space truly doesn't unravel itself.
Yeah, I guess so. And I we've talked in other episodes about the outcomes that we have seen on this file and whether or not there's any positivity. And we've often started the conversation in a very negative tone. But when we go back and really look at what we've just said, that in fact, there were lessons learned. And if you pay attention, we seem to be learning from them. Yes. We're making improvements. That changes the lens around. You talked about expectation. Yeah. So I think that's a really important part of it, particularly when we're talking about political vision.
I agree with you. And I do think, if I were a politician listening to this conversation, and the first question I need to ask is, why am I not having conversations that are bringing the changing tides into the equation, right? Why am I still doing the same thing I've been doing, arguably, for the past 5 decades with some tweaks here and there to bring some social media elements into it, right? Why am I not examining how some of these tides are naturally shifting and my role in helping accelerate that process? We talk in past conversations, Dave, we've talked a lot about the role corporations can play. And they do play a huge role. And I'll give you a great example. Let's say somebody comes up with a fantastic protein bar. And that protein bar is made with a certain type of protein that is easily accessible. There's no supply chain issues. It's very, very reasonably priced. It's nutritionally dense. What will happen? what'll happen is people who are tight on their budgets will buy it because it helps them, let's say in the middle of their shift job, it's affordable, and sometimes even a replacement for a meal. What will also happen is people who have the means will still buy it because it serves an important set of purposes for them. And even though they don't think about the price, they'll still buy it and relate to that brand. So this is an example where a corporation can actually play a significant role in bridging what is otherwise a brand-led divide between the haves and the have-nots, right? This is a classic scenario of, oh, you see, I don't know, Gucci handbag on one person, and then on the other person, you see a ripped cloth bag, right? This is sort of the classic narrative. Mm-hmm. And you go, hey, that person may be poor. And I think what we need to figure out is how to break those molds, because the consumer, human beings are getting there slowly because they're getting there because they're becoming more self-aware. So talk about the positives of it. Consumers are getting there anyway. I think the question we're asking is, how do we get organizations, governments, politicians, nonprofits, the news media, how do we get everybody playing their part?
Two things on that, though. On the one hand, I mean, you're essentially talking about our own, we're talking about self-awareness, but at the same time, we're not aware of our bias in that
That's right.
scenario.
Yeah.
So getting over that is one thing, but then we go back to that whole, the word privilege, where we're using it more in a sense of self-awareness. On the other hand, it's politically charged. It's become part of this cancel culture bullshit.
That's right.
People, right? So it becomes one of those touch points that a politician wants to stay away from in many cases, because it ignites a fire that you can't put out.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Dave. And, if I think so obviously a majority of our work is with large companies and big brands. And in many ways, they have the same challenge, right? Because they don't want to touch anything that might be politically charged for fear that it would be misinterpreted. But the thing that we keep reminding them is that we now live in a world where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Right? So if you don't touch something, people will make assumptions. If you touch something, you're going to piss off half the people. Right? And the question you have to determine is, which avenue gives me a little bit more control? Because no matter what we do, we don't have full control over the narrative. That's just the reality of modern life. So which avenue gives me a little bit more control, and how can I? And the how is the most critical piece. If I was writing that out, I would underline that 3 times, because this is why we study how meaning and language is changing, right? So I'll give you an example. If you imagine you're drawing a tree, like an ontology, a tree, a family tree from privilege, and you start drawing that tree out, one branch of it will be cancel culture. Another branch of it will be self-awareness. Another branch of it will be something about gender and, let's say, feminism. Another branch of it may be something about sexuality and identity, right? So what you do is, when you start to analyze how meaning is constructed in our minds, you realize we actually compartmentalize things. So we have these branches. And when you start to build sort of this family tree, if you will, for the lack of a better term, what you can then decide is, which branch do I want to really put my money on, right? That's where I can focus. That's where I can bring clarity of voice. And that's where I can potentially own a conversation. And we are seeing a lot of examples of this, Dave, is when people do that, there's significantly less chance of being misinterpreted. There's significantly greater opportunity to say, this is my field of expertise. This is my branch. And I'm sorry, the branch you're taking me on, I don't have anything to say on that. And that's okay. And the reason why the consumer is happy with that is because you have something to say, right? That's half the battle.
Yeah, so I guess picking a lane and being clear about why you're there is an important part of it. And again, I bring it back to an election cycle anywhere. It doesn't matter whether it's in Ontario or across the country, around the world, where we're going to have to rely on what you have just described as a key component plus a little bit of courage
Yeah.
as far as our new sense of leadership is concerned. I mean, the meaning of leadership in this context changes.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, here's a question I would ask the listener, you know, if the issue of poverty impacts you one way or another, right? As a citizen, as a voter, maybe as a politician, as somebody who's running a nonprofit, whatever it is. When was the last time you asked what it really means to people? Because until you ask that, the problem is then we make assumptions, and the moment we make assumptions, we automatically go to the logical frame in our brains, right? We define poverty as an income level, you know, as a certain as a certain type of person. We have all these biases in our heads. We imagine certain types of people there, and all of this other stuff starts to happen. Until we ask those questions, I think this is why anthropology is so intriguing to me, because it forces us to constantly ask, what does that really mean today? And I can tell you, that branch example I gave you on the word privilege, you wouldn't arrive there if you did a logical deconstruction of privilege. You would arrive there if you said, let's deconstruct it through the human lens. Let's see how people are talking in the broader context of the topic of privilege. And then you'll see, oh, these are sort of the branches that are inadvertently sort of naturally happening in people's heads. I think that's the interesting and that's the critical piece here is, let's ask the question, what does this really mean today? And where do we think it's headed? Because oftentimes, Dave, this is the other challenge is I don't believe that we can genuinely, U-turn a culture. It's very difficult to do that, but we can influence it.
So are we more likely to help the eradication of poverty, that mission in and of itself? Are we more likely to get to that point by, I use this phrase carefully, but backing into the conversation through this privilege discussion? Because I can see that if all of a sudden I'm become more aware, or if I ask the question, how is it affecting me vis-a-vis poverty, whether it's a family member or anyone else, and I then become aware comparatively that, holy cow, they do not have what I have. Yeah, that's sort of backing into that privilege understanding.
Yeah, and so just to build on that, Dave, what you just described, right? What we would really want to do is take it to the next level. So we all often think about what somebody doesn't have, and then we think about the basic necessities of life. We kind of conjure up Maslow's hierarchy in our heads, think, food, water, shelter, right? Good education, that kind of thing. I think where it becomes really powerful is when people put it into the minutia day-to-day context of their lives, right? Like last night, we were really tired to cook. We pulled up an app and ordered a meal, right? That's a moment of recognition of the sheer privilege involved in being able to do that. Can you imagine somebody who's working 3 shift jobs, who's, barely sleeping and somehow wanting to provide for their child at home, who maybe not even has proper childcare, being able to do that? It's impossible. They would never conceive of being able to do that. Or if they did, that's eating away into whatever wages they had earmarked for whatever thing. So I think that's the interesting part for me, is when it starts to hit into the daily minutia of our lives, that's when it shakes the tree, if you will. And the other part I'll also tell you is, if I examine poverty as a topic, right, automatically people start thinking, this is the other issue. People start thinking developing country, third world. People don't realize this is happening in our backyards, right? That's the other part too, is the changing meaning. And again, I'm this, just to be clear, this is not a pessimistic view. This is actually an optimistic view, because we're seeing how this is changing, right? People are now starting to ask that question. Oh, this is not just about a country in Asia or Africa. This is about our backyards. Did you know, right? Did you know? I think that's the interesting part too. But I haven't seen a lot of that level of discourse, certainly in the political sphere, if you will.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said off the top, I think it's incremental, and maybe what's pessimistic about all of this is that it was so incremental, it was historic. So it, you know,
that's
wow, really?
That's
we're excited about this. Listen, it's always great to talk to you. Thanks for your insight on this, and it will certainly help us inform the discussion moving forward. Thanks, Ujwal.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the 2030 Project. We would encourage you to subscribe to this show. We're on Apple and Spotify, Google, Audible, pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. We'd also be grateful if you'd offer a rating on the show. We'd love your thoughts, your feedback, even your criticism. The 2030 Project podcast series is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. I'm Dave Trafford, and the 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast produced by Eye Contact Productions.